We are now going to employ the principles of supply and demand to analyze some markets. Specifically, we'll go over the problems sent to you, the ones we're going to go over in class as well, but this will provide a good review. So here's an issue. New studies determine that farm-raised salmon do not provide any of the health benefits, or the healthy benefits, associated with consuming wild salmon. So that's one factor that's happening. At the same time, harsh weather in the North Atlantic seriously disrupts the salmon fishing season. So we have two events here. One will affect supply and one will affect demand. And it says, how will this occurrences affect the market for, notice, wild salmon. So that's going to be our market here, wild salmon. So let's take each piece of this puzzle and investigate how both the change in demand and change in supply will ultimately affect the market. The first bit of information tells us that farm-raised salmon are not viewed as healthy as they were previously. So which is this going to affect, supply or demand? Well, if we think about it, it's going to affect the buyers in the market. And what's going to happen is there's going to be an increase in the taste and preferences for the wild salmon. So again, up top here it should say wild salmon for your markets, right? It should say wild salmon, and on the right you should identify the non-price determinant. In this case it would be taste and preferences. All right? There's an increase in taste and preferences, and you should always write down there's an increase in demand, right? There's going to be an increase in demand because of the increased taste and preferences. And if just this happened, the increase in demand would bring us to a new equilibrium where there was an increase in quantity and an increase in price. Now that's not the only thing that happened, but if it were the only thing that happened, our problem would be over. But simultaneously we have an issue here, right? Where we start at E1 here, but there's been some harsh weather. We can call that a non-price determinant of supply. We can call it technology, or we can call it number of sellers. In other words, not as many wild salmon will be caught because it would be difficult for as many boats to deal with these rough seas. So either way, there's a decrease in supply. And what does that do? All right. Well, at the new equilibrium, quantity decreases and price goes up. So what's the final result here? Well, it's important to identify what happened, the final result of this wild salmon. Well, we know we had supply decrease because of the harsh weather, the rough seas. We also had a demand increase because of an increase in the taste and preferences. Both the supply decrease and the demand increase raised the price, because a decrease in supply drives price up and an increase in demand drives price up. So we know that happened for certain. But your decrease in supply actually decreases quantity. At the same time, your increase in demand increases quantity. So the final result then is price definitely increases, and quantity is what we refer to as indeterminate. We're not sure, and the reason why is we don't know the magnitude of the shifts. Was there a significant decrease in supply and only a little increase in demand, or vice versa? But we know that there is definitely an increase in the price of wild salmon, quantity indeterminate. It's also good to make this point. You should always draw these particular problems when you have some event that affects both supply and demand occurring simultaneously in a market. Draw separate graphs so you can plainly see which one of your two variables, in this case price, is going to have a definitive change, in this case an increase, and what's going to happen in one of your variables is going to be indeterminate. So let's move on to question number 2. New regulations passed by the government increase concerns among business owners about hiring full-time employees. There's been a lot of talk about this in the news over the past, say, 18 and 24 months, how some of the cumbersome government regulations make it more costly for business owners to hire full-time employees with benefits and such. So if this is the case, how will these developments affect the market for temporary workers? So here our market is temp workers, temporary workers. Alright, so again, it should say up top there temporary workers, right? Temporary workers on top of your supply and demand graph here. And so what's happening there? Well, we can say either taste and preferences or more likely number of buyers. There's going to be an increase in the number of buyers. In this case, the buyers are the business owners, right? They're demanding labor. So this is the market for temporary workers, temporary labor. So we're going to have an increase in demand based on an increase in the number of buyers, right? And what will that do? Well, that will increase the quantity and then also increase the price, the wage earned by these temporary workers. And because there's only a single shift here, there's only one event, this would be our final result for this problem, right? An increase in demand based on the increase in number of buyers, shifts the demand curve to the right, final result, increase in price, increase in quantity, right? It's always important to identify what happened at your new equilibrium. You can't just say demand increased. That's great. If it's good that you understand the demand increase, but the entire purpose of using these tools of supply and demand is to analyze what happened in the market. And markets involve prices and quantity. So at the new equilibrium, the price in the market is higher and quantity is increased. Moving right along to the third problem, automobile manufacturers around the globe announced plans to equip all vehicles with auto-driving capabilities by the year 2018. Now, if you haven't been keeping up with this news, this is actually going to be a game changer. The idea that in the near future, actually a lot closer around the corner than most of us think, or maybe some of us even desire, human beings will no longer be driving cars. We're going to be living in a world where the automobiles drive themselves. And Google's big on this, the Google car which drives itself, and traditional manufacturers of automobiles are actually investing in this technology. It's definitely not 5 years away, but it's probably less than 20 years away. And we'll talk more about it in class. But how will this information affect the market for computerized sensors necessary for these automobiles to function properly on roads and highways? So obviously we can't just have these new automobiles which are non-human driven. So they're completely operated by computers, these computerized cars. We can't just put them free on the road and hope that they get to their destinations. We need these sensors along the highways and byways to make certain that they keep on path and they're able to determine where they are and how far they are from the car in front of them and such and such. All right, so obviously, who's going to be the buyer of this? This is a good question here. Maybe not so obvious. Who's going to be the buyer of these computerized sensors that are going to be necessary to make computerized cars safe? Well, this would be, in this case, the government. The government's going to be buying these particular sensors. And this case is very much similar to the last case we looked at. If this is the market for computerized sensors for roads that enable cars to drive themselves, here we are now. We're at equilibrium 1 with a certain price for these sensors and a certain quantity. There's definitely going to be an increase in demand due to the either increase in taste and preferences, but more likely the number of buyers. In other words, maybe the federal government's going to get in, some state governments, some local governments, increase in the number of buyers, so an increase in demand, which brings us to E2. And again, it's important to identify at our new equilibrium, quantity has increased and price has increased. So to wrap this one up, the final result is at E2, higher market equilibrium price, higher market equilibrium quantity due to the increase in demand because of the number of buyers. All right, in this next problem, we're going to be analyzing the market for global wheat prices. And we have a little issue here between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Peace talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians break down. And these geopolitical events, they impair the ability of Ukraine, which is the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union and a large grower of many agricultural products, including wheat. So it impairs their ability of the Ukrainians to harvest their wheat farms. So how will this event affect the global price of wheat, right? Well, in this case, we start off here at E1 with a certain price and quantity. And our non-price determinant will be number of sellers, because there's going to be fewer sellers globally if the Ukrainians cannot harvest all of their agricultural plants that have been already put into the ground. So decrease in the number of sellers, which decreases supply. All right, and what's the result here? Well, that will create a decrease in quantity in the market at the new equilibrium E2 and an increase in price. So again, to wrap this one up, decrease in the number of sellers decreases supply. Leftward shift of the supply curve drives price up and quantity down. So at the new equilibrium E2, higher equilibrium price, lower, smaller equilibrium quantity, and that's a wrap. Moving on to the next problem, we're going to be analyzing the market for paint, simple household paint. Alright, so the economic recovery encourages people to increase the number of home improvement projects, including painting their walls and ceilings and bathrooms and floors, maybe even the outside of their house exterior. Alright, so that's an easy one. We're going to talk about that's probably going to affect demand. Simultaneously, there's a significant increase in the price of binder. So binder is a key and necessary component in producing paint, so it's a resource. How will these combined situations affect the paint market? Alright, so let's talk about demand first. Again, you would label this up top paint. You write the word paint up top there. And then you would have your equilibrium at E1 here, your P1, and then what happens? Well, there's an increase either in taste and preferences or number of buyers would be your non-price determinant. Either way, that increase in number of buyers or taste and preferences, probably number of buyers would increase demand. At your new equilibrium, you would have higher equilibrium quantity in this market and higher equilibrium price. Now again, if that were the only factor taking place in this market, this problem would be finished. Say increase the number of buyers, increase demand, result, higher equilibrium price, higher equilibrium quantity. But we know there's more going on, so we have to move on and say, okay, something affected at the same time supply. So here we have this idea of a resource price going up, and that's going to shift the supply curve to the left, decreasing the supply from S1 to S2. So because an input, a factor of production, necessary resource, in this case binder to make paint, has gone up in price, there's a decrease in supply. How does that affect the equilibrium? Well, at the new equilibrium, quantity goes down and price goes up. Alright, so let's take the two factors and say, what's the final result here in the market for paints? What's the final result in the market for paint? We know that supply decreases because of the increase in the price of a necessary resource, driving up price and driving quantity down. Likewise, we know demand increases due to the number of buyers increasing, a non-price determinant, and that increases equilibrium price and increases equilibrium quantity. So our final result is price definitely increases and quantity is indeterminate.